Hello everyone, here we are back with another declutter. This is not the first declutter I've done this year, but this is going to be the official kickstart of my spring declutter series. I'm going to be going through my entire collection of eyeshadow palettes today, giving you all speed reviews. That is what I absolutely love to do here on my channel. When I'm giving you guys declutter videos, I'm also giving you a look at these actual items. I'm going to be doing a pretty heavy declutter today, or at least I'm hoping to. I need to make some space in my collection. So if you love detail-oriented reviews, declutters, and you're looking for just really incredible makeup formulas, my name's Amanda. I would love to have you back. I'll leave all the products I covered today down below for you all, and with that, let's just jump in. You know, I always think it's good to start on a positive note. So why not start with the Natasha Denona Groundwork palette, which was easily one of my most used palettes of 2023. And I'm almost positive it was in Best of Beauty 2023. But essentially, what Natasha Janona has done here, I think is pretty incredible. We are taking a new approach to neutrals. I don't know if you guys have heard that like trending audio that it's like with an outfit, if it's not interesting in texture, it needs to be interesting in color, vice versa. That is the way I feel about this palette. Is it the most interesting palette as far as colors go? Absolutely not. It's a neutral palette. But what she's managed to do is make it more interesting via the textures. So you have both, by the way, I'm filming very early in the morning today, so if you hear a lot of birds chirping, well, it is springtime here. I find it very calming, honestly. Anyway, so she has managed to create all of these different putty textures to use, but you also get the corresponding matte powders to go with them. So what I find particularly beautiful about that concept is that I'm getting, in general, more long wear effect if I layer them, but also I have the versatility of just going with a bunch of cream shadows, which cream shadows for a very long time were the only textures that I used as far as shadows go. That might sound kind of crazy to some of you, but cream shadows are what got me into eyeshadows in general. Quite honestly, I've never been displeased with a look that I've created with this because the tones also all really go together. The matte shades within here are not like drying mattes, and they can absolutely be built up. For me personally, if you are a lover of neutral eyeshadows, I think that this is one of the best eyeshadow palettes on the market. So this is certainly staying in my collection. Speaking of cream eyeshadow palettes, this is a new product from Huda Beauty. This is the Creamy Obsessions palette, and this is the neutral brown. So I was leaning towards the other one, but then having seen the looks online, I decided to go with this palette, and I do think that it was a good decision. I think this palette is still best geared towards the everyday makeup wearer. It's not necessarily an experimental palette, but I do think it is good, again, for an everyday look. So what's a little bit different about these cream textures versus something like the cream textures of the Danessa Myricks is that these feel creamier in the finger, and yet when they go down onto the eyes, they kind of immediately turn to powder, whereas those putty textures from Danessa Myricks, they always kind of feel like a putty. There's not necessarily like a transformative quality to them. This palette is also, it's not the most pigmented, at least in my experience. There are definitely more washes of color that you build up. I actually did a video on this. I don't think that that is necessarily a good or bad thing. I think it's a preference. We should all be taking stock of the kinds of items that we actually reach for. I think it's so important that if you're the kind of person that loves high pigmentation, that you continue to buy products that fit that preference rather than forcing yourself necessarily to use products that are way better built up on the skin? I'll leave that video down below because I do think it's a really important question that we ask ourselves. I will say kind of the standout shadow of this palette is this beautiful sparkly top coat. You guys know how much I absolutely love wet looking eyeshadows, and this is absolutely a standout. Really melts down onto the skin, which is not always the case with some sparkly top coats. Some remain quite scattered looking. I do like when a wet eyeshadow can kind of melt down and create one seamless effect. It really does help to give that reflective look. I definitely think that it's a good cream eyeshadow palette. However, I don't think this is the best cream eyeshadow formula I've used. I think there's a difference there, but I am going to be keeping it for now. I think that this is going to disappoint some people when I talk about the Natasha Denona Hyper Natural Face Palette. Now, I'm including it in today's video, even though there are there is a face portion of the palette. It's not just eyeshadows, but I think it's important to talk about what makes a good everyday palette, what makes an eyeshadow palette that is actually going to be functional as, that basic, that product that you can always go back to. I'm not always utilitarian with my makeup choices, but for this kind of everyday palette you're supposed to use all the time, I'm looking for that utilitarian aspect, and this just, it does not have it. First of all, the fact that these are the only matte shades you get in here, not only is this not enough shades for all skin tones, just for the face, to me you need more definition. I think one more darker shade within the palette, I would be less critical of it. Also, this beautiful sparkly top coat, it's the shade Dreamy. It's dreamy. I mean, it is very, very pretty. But for the price of this, I just can't justify telling you guys to purchase something when only one of the eyeshadows really feels inspired to me. For example, this kind of like everyday brown shade, it's literally called Everyday. It's nice, but I don't know. I don't know if there's only so much you guys can tell from a swatch, which is why I'm always giving context with my swatches, but it just doesn't look special to me. On the eyes, I found it to be pretty, but kind of flat. It's something in between a satin and a metallic, and sometimes that realm can get boring. I'm going to actually declutter this palette. If you guys do see this in an upcoming video, just know that it's on its way out, but I might just keep it for like a viral products that aren't worth the money kind of video. Would you guys like to see that? I always appreciate your feedback. I am listening, so never be afraid to leave me a comment. But shall we talk about an eyeshadow palette from Natasha Janona that I do think is worth the money? The Natasha Janona I Need a Nude palette. What an absolutely epic eyeshadow palette. The reason I love it is, one, it is not overly warm toned. Oh, I just love to see it. Just because I'm not like a huge warm toned eyeshadow person. I do love a warm tone shadow, and honestly, like I think they actually look better for my complexion and my hair color and all of the above, but I just can't help what, my heart leans towards, and it truly is these kind of color stories. Aside from the color story though, which is a big piece of this, the mattes in here are incredibly blendable and actually beautiful for every day. So let me walk you through a few that I use the most. So this shade Vague is one that I absolutely love. Whenever I add this into the lid, I just feel like I'm getting the right amount of saturated definition. It does have like a powderiness to it, but there's also a decent amount of silicone in her matte formula, which for me, I personally find really easy for quick looks, especially. So everyday eyeshadows, the mattes, her matte formula, I really, really enjoy. Now this shade Tender, another one of these defining shades that I just find to be particularly easy in my looks. You only need a little bit and you are able to really add some great definition. And finally, as far as the mattes go, this shade Silhouette, if you guys see me with like a wet glossy eyeshadow and a wing liner, there's a good chance that it is the shade Silhouette from this palette, and then any of the wet shadows that are actually in the palette. So there are a few that I love. The shade Ella is one of them. This one is more of a warm toned brown. You can see that there is more of a sheer base pigment, which is kind of what you want if you want a super, super glossy looking shadow. But my two personal favorites are the shade Sheen. This is like the perfect wet looking eyeshadow for every day because the particles are so fine. So that's Sheen right there on the top. So beautiful and very, again, everyday appropriate because the particles really melt down onto the eyes. So I love Sheen. And then my other favorite is Delilah, which unfortunately is a little bit loose in the pan, which always makes me a little bit nervous, but I'm gonna put it right here next to Sheen so you guys can get a better idea of the two, like my two favorite shades. There's a good chance that any day of the week I'm using either of these. They're just my most used. Do you see how the base pigment isn't so flat? There's a nice translucence to it, which really makes the wet sparkles come alive. So still one of my favorite luxury products in my collection. Absolutely beautiful. Really the only critique I have of it is I wish there was like a black or a even deeper brown. But honestly, I use Silhouette like all the time and it kind of, it does a lot of the legwork. So is it absolutely necessary for me? No, but I still kind of wish it was there. But anyway, absolutely love this palette. However, if you are someone that prefers even more matte shades with just in general, even more variety, I think the Glam palette actually might be a better bet for you. And honestly, as far as like the tones go in these mattes, I find them to be absolutely beautiful. However, the sparkly shades in here, I don't love them as much as the I Need a Nude palette. I do, however, love this outer eyelid shade in the palette. I'll swatch it right here for you. But it is very similar to like some of the eyeshadows that you already have in the I Need a Nude palette. It is definitely like one of my favorite shades in this entire palette though. I will say the mattes do hit it out of the park. Like this shade right here, just an absolutely beautiful warm brown. This crease shade never, ever steers me wrong. And this smoke shade, the lash line shade, I mean, again, all of these matte shades do really, really well. If you prefer more straight metallics, so I'll give you an example here. This is a metallic versus like a wet sparkle shade. So again, this is more sparkly wet, and this is just straight metallic. So you guys can see the difference in the finish. Metallic is sparkly, but there's more like pieces of glitter within the wet looking eyeshadow, and also the base is more translucent than the metallic. Hopefully that's helpful so you guys can really distinguish when I'm talking about wet looking sparkly top coats versus like a metallic. Anyway, I do still really love this one. I am going to be keeping it, but let's get started on some palettes that I do need to declutter. So this is an eyeshadow palette that I was incredibly excited for, which is from 3CE. It is the Overtake palette, and it's just unfortunate. I feel like I might need your all's help on this. I haven't had a lot of luck with KBeauty eyeshadows in general. Sometimes I just find that I haven't found my perfect formula yet, so feel free to leave a comment down below and let me know what I should try. But I originally was really excited for this palette because of these sequin shades. In theory, they're really pretty, but unfortunately, they're just, the pigmentation isn't where I'd like them to be. I feel like sequin shades though are some of the most difficult to formulate because you still really want that sparkle to come through, but sometimes the sparkle washes away really quickly when you're blending. I just find myself consistently not reaching for this one, so I am going to go ahead and declutter it, unfortunately. And you know what? This might actually be surprising to some of you. I think I am going to go ahead and declutter my Rebel palette from Charlotte Tilbury. So again, one of the main reasons I bought this palette was for this sequin shade over here. I I still actually really, really love this sequin shade. And I think this is sequin done right. Sparkles actually truly come through, but the other shades in the palette are just so lacking. The metallics are not, they don't feel inspired enough for me. Like, I just feel like I can't keep an entire palette just for one sequin shade that I really love. I feel like the potential here would be that I depot this one and then just get rid of the other ones. But if like I have a friend that wants all of them, then I'm just going to give this to them. But either way, going in the declutter bin for now. I actually do have another Charlotte Tilbury quad that I'll talk about soon. I need to find it. Stay on the green trend. So this is the Nouveau palette. What's become kind of unfortunate with this palette is it's really just got lost within my collection. The mattes are beautiful. They are so good. This shade Liberty, the reason the palettes have stood the test of time in many cases is because the formula is just so consistent. This shade Metro, like these two shades together, this is a very pretty spring palette. Like for me to pull this out during any time of the year, I mean, spring has got to be the time. So what I'm gonna do is try to get some good use out of this palette this spring. I mean, for example, this shade Lily is like one of the best shades in the palette. Just that beautiful peachy pink. I mean, it's really like a crowd pleaser. So this one's just gonna have to come back out. And honestly, Wisteria, like, can you guys imagine just like a one shadow look with just Wisteria? Like this time of year, a really soft purple eye, I think it would look really pretty. Gonna keep this one for now and try to get some more use out of it because I do think it's a great one. However, out of the two, I think I have two Anastasia Beverly Hills palettes. Out of the two palettes that I have, I will say that I do prefer the Rose Metals, and I wasn't expecting that to be the case. It's just a very, very pretty palette. This shade Haze for a very long time has been just the perfect grungy green gold for me. I mean, look at that. What I love about Anastasia Beverly Hills metallics is they're not shy with the pigment. They just are so, so reflective. Actually, as far as like straight metallic formulas go, I prefer the Anastasia to the Natasha Denona. But unfortunately, Anastasia Beverly Hills doesn't really do wet looking eyeshadows necessarily. I mean, there is somewhat of a wet quality to this, but not as many like sparkly top coat kind of items within Anastasia Beverly Hills. I'd love to see them create that formula. Here's the shade Nova. Again, if you're just a fan of like olive undertones, like if you have an olive undertone, this is a really great palette as far as metallics go. And this shade Noble, which I have barely really used, but just really great for those of you that love these more smoky, kind of grungy looks. This palette is grungier than maybe I was even expecting, and yet I still love it the same. Maybe something that's a little bit frustrating about eyeshadow palettes is that because so many are coming out so quickly, I personally find it difficult to like really nurture my love for one. So I really want to start trying and doing that this year. Now, again, another palette that I'm going to be decluttering is this palette from Natasha Denona. It is the mini gold palette. Again, there's really nothing wrong with this. I don't reach for it anymore. This green shade, very pretty. The gold shade, stunning. I mean, really, really pretty. This shade over here, which actually might be like underdog shade of the palette, so gorgeous. I love the color story of it. But there is something to me that feels almost outdated about this, and I can't put my finger on it, so I am going to go ahead and declutter it. A newer palette to my collection that I really enjoy is from Revlon. It is the Handbag palette in Unnatural World. Really such a beautiful palette. And I do kind of wonder why more people aren't talking about this brand, because the formulas are really pretty. In fact, now that I think about this formula versus something like the Creamy Obsessions formula from Huda Beauty, I prefer this. Some are creamier than others. This is more of like, this doesn't necessarily feel like cream, like a cream, but hopefully you guys can truly see how flattering it is. Like if you have very dry eyelids, or you just find that the typical run-of-the-mill powder eyeshadow just does not do it for your eyelids and doesn't make the quality of your skin look good, I think that these palettes might be good to look into, because they really just add this lit from within radiance to the skin. I don't think we talk enough about how the quality of our eyelids look when we apply shadow. And again, that is a big reason why I didn't use powder eyeshadow for a really long time. It just made my eyelids look very dry. However, I had to repress that, as you might be able to see. Again, look again. Do you see the smoothness that this imparts onto the skin? Just this beautiful reflection. And again, these are just like typical kind of matte shadows in this palette. This sparkly shade up here, beautiful again. I mean, look at that. It's just so nice to layer on top of eyeshadows. Here, you can get a better idea of like the gleam of it there. And finally, you have this incredibly opaque cream shadow at the bottom that is kind of something between a cream and a gloss. I find these to be really inspired. So maybe, yeah, maybe it's worth noting now that like this to me feels more current. I think the formulas feel really innovative. I think the color story is really nice. Now let's do a quick comparison, because I just talked about how this feels a little bit outdated. These swatches versus like, I'll give you guys a couple swatches of the Natasha Denona. There's just kind of a lightness to the color palette and the textures of these, whereas the Natasha Denona just feels, it feels a little weightier, it feels a little bit heavier. And I do think as a whole, we are noticing trends leaning towards just lighter and brighter eye looks. So that might be part of it here. Either way, I am going to be keeping the Revlon, and then this is being decluttered. Shall we talk a bit about Tom Ford? Tom Ford, their quads have been such a big like hit or miss product for me, unfortunately. And I know that they are like cult favorites for so many people, but I just gotta be honest with you guys here. A lot of the time I don't think that they're necessarily worth the money. Like for example, the wet or dry formula in Nude Dip. This is a palette that like people have loved for literally years. And admittedly, like this shade in particular, I think is really pretty, especially when you get it wet on the eyes. And I do think that there's kind of like this timelessness about the color story. These like washes of soft pearly pigment, they're always going to be pretty. And yet I still feel myself being underwhelmed by them in some capacity, probably because they're just so expensive for what you're getting. And they do feel a little bit frosty to me. You know, I've kept the Nude Dip palette in my collection for a while. I've been doing videos on like makeup cult classics. Would you guys consider this one to be a cult classic? I think I'm gonna keep it for now, if you guys do think so, because I'll cover this palette in my makeup cult classics video and then probably declutter it. But you guys let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts. Also in general on makeup cult classics, whether certain cult classic products are worth the money or not. So feel free to leave your thoughts down below on that. I'm gonna keep that one for now, but I am going to go ahead and declutter the Golden Mink palette. I pretty much bought this palette for the sparkly top coats, which are very, very pretty. But these two shades are like throwaway shades. Like they did the most with two shades in here, and then for the rest of the palette they were like, Like, what is that? Can you guys even see what I just swatched? Just like, they could have done so much more with it. Would actually be kind of my ideal Tom Ford palette. Would be a combination of both of these, like the sparkly top coats within here with these more creamy cream shadows that Tom Ford has come out with. So this is the Smoky Quartz palette. By far my favorite Tom Ford eyeshadow quad. The looks I get with these, you know, now that I'm thinking about it, these textures are pretty similar to the textures from Revlon. You see how there's just like this general smoothness? It adds like a really smooth quality to the skin. These don't last really long, but I'm willing to work with them with like an eye base to make them last a little bit longer. So I am going to go ahead and keep this one to use. And I think I need to finally declutter Golden Mink and have someone else take a shot at using it. Speaking of wet looking eyeshadows, I will be keeping the Makeup by Mario Ethereal Eyes palette. Truly, I will never forget when I saw this launch. I was like, this is going to be my dream palette. I even still look at it and just I'm kind of in awe of the color story, the textures. I think they're all so pretty, but actually in practice, I think that the mattes are just a little bit too powdery for my preference. There's just a lot of kickback, and then on the eyes, they can look a little bit dry. And also, the sparkly top coats in here don't exactly want to adhere to the eyes as readily as I would like. And they're all so close that they kind of look the same once they're on the eyes. It's one of those things though, like if you have had luck with the Makeup by Mario matte formula, I do think it's worth a shot, especially because this could just be such a perfect everyday eyeshadow palette. But I did a completely like dedicated video comparing this to the I Need a Nude palette from Natasha Denona. Short story is that I prefer the I Need a Nude, but I am keeping this for the library because it feels like I still get questions on it. So if you're not familiar with what the makeup library is, it's essentially makeup items that I don't reach for a ton or might not even like a lot. Like that's not the case with this. I do think like it's a good palette, but I don't reach for it a lot because I already know I think that I Need a Nude is better. But I kind of keep items that I need to reference or get a lot of questions on. So this is going to be like a makeup library item. The palette that I will be decluttering from Dior is the Backstage Khaki Neutrals. This is pretty similar now that I'm looking at it to the Natasha Denona palette that I just decluttered. I do lean, like my preferences kind of lean towards the khaki neutrals, but you can't get this anymore and no one's talking about it. And then it's just sitting here and collecting dust. So for that reason alone, I do want to declutter it. Shall we get into Pat McGrath? I have 4 eyeshadow palettes from Pat McGrath. I have, what is this palette called? It's either the Sublime or the Subliminal. I can never find it. Also because on the back, it doesn't say. I'll leave links down below. So I have this palette. I have the Moonlit Seduction palette. I have the Utopian Dream palette. And then I have my favorite, which is the Divine Rose palette from Pat McGrath. Now I want to go ahead right off the bat and say, by far the 2 first palettes that I purchased from Pat McGrath are still my favorites, which are the Utopian Dream and the Divine Rose. So let's go ahead and just start there. I think depending on your preference with eyeshadow palettes and what you're really looking for is going to determine which one of these is actually going to work better for you. So if you're looking for a really inspired eyeshadow palette that is also beautiful for every day, I would say Divine Rose. Like if there's one palette I could recommend from Pat McGrath to get a Pat McGrath experience while also actually being able to use it all the time, it would be this palette. You do get a taste for some of her unique textures with these more like baked formulas that also have like cool, pretty shifts. You have this absolutely iconic special shade that really can liven up any look. But you also have some really beautiful satin shades that just, there really is not another formula as far as eyeshadows go that are like Pat McGrath. I would say she does satin shades in such a pretty way, but even the matte shades, they just have a ton of pigment. So if that's what you like, I think that you'll really enjoy her formulas. But you can just see here how like everyday the color story is. I love this shade right over here too. Pat McGrath is so creative with her looks, many of which are like incredibly avant-garde, and you know, a lot of folks were going crazy over like her doll makeup for Maison Margiela earlier in the year. But for the everyday makeup user, I can't help but go back to this staple. I am going to keep this one. That's a no-brainer for me. Also going to keep Utopian Dream because I feel like this is like a dreamier version of the Divine Rose palette, and it is a little bit warmer, a little bit more saturated. I really enjoyed this shade in particular. Like, what a beautiful, beautiful coral shade that is. I mean, these special shades are also incredible. I mean, look at the way they layer. So pretty, incredibly unique. I think if you want to start playing in the Pat McGrath world and you're not afraid of some more interesting colors rather than like very everyday colors, I would go with Utopian Dream. I keep saving these two palettes that I'm talking about for a rainy day, and yet they just keep sitting here. So that, I think the Moonlit Seduction palette was unfortunately a miss for me because a lot of the special shades aren't that baked formula. They're all pretty, like there's nothing necessarily wrong with them. For example, let me give you a swatch of this gold in the Moonlit Seduction palette. So that is the gold right there in the Moonlit Seduction. And then I'll give you a swatch of the one from the Utopian Dream, which is right here. The Utopian Dream is a drier formula. So here we go. I'm not sure if you guys can even tell the difference on the hand, but special shades used to be even more reflective. I think the formula is just a little bit different. It's not necessarily a bad thing though, because these do feel more like everyday appropriate, I would say. And you know what? I will say this. Like, as I'm hearing myself kind of talk out the reasons why the Moonlit Seduction palette didn't do it for me, if I kind of look at this in its own space and don't compare it to the other Pat McGrath palettes, I kind of start to like it more. I might kind of use this palette as an opportunity to do a video on like products I was disappointed in. Let's revisit, see if I'm still disappointed in them, because opinions do change. Give it one last try. If it doesn't work, I'll declutter. But I am going to go ahead and declutter the Sublime or Subliminal palette. Still can't figure out which one this is. But I do feel like this is too precious to just be sitting here collecting dust. The best bang for your buck eyeshadow palette on the market is the Lorac Pro palette. They have the Noir, which is my favorite because of the cooler tones, but they have other color stories. Do you see how gross this is? Like, it's because I use it all of the time. What is so beautiful about this palette is that you get so many matte eyeshadow options. You get metallics in here, and you get those wet, sparkly top coats. Hands are smaller and you get way more shades, which brands are really not doing that much anymore. But think about it, how often do you actually go through an entire like single shadow shade? Let me swatch some of my favorites for you all. This shade down here, I use this shade alone a ton because it's just such an incredible wet look shadow. I also use this one. It's basically, they're all like these kind of more translucent wet look sparkly top coats. But what they do right, which is not the case with something like the Makeup by Mario Ethereal Eyes, is that the undertones are different enough that it actually makes sense why you would have them. Another example of this is like, this is one that I use a ton. This more like light colored, basically white sparkly top coat. Do you see how all three of those are so distinctive? You get options. which is why I like use this palette so much. The metallics are also very pretty, though admittedly I like reach for the wet sparkly top coats more often. And the mattes are also what I'm reaching for the most. So this like dark brown is one that I'm using for liner pretty much all the time when I'm using this palette. This black, matte black, I mean, the pigment is there. Yeah, this is definitely like a best palette, like best bang for your buck, but in general, it's just a really, really good palette. I wouldn't be surprised if like I tried this and someone said, how much do you think this is? I'd say, again, like around like 65 bucks. Have not stopped using it since I got it. And again, you can see within my collection, that's not always the case. So again, highly recommend this one. If there are any other Lorac palettes you guys would particularly like me to try, let me know. For me, it's like I don't know how it could get better than this, so I haven't bought another one, but it's just, it's so good. You know what? There is this brand that I've tried a few of their products, but I've never talked about them in depth on my channel, and it's this brand called Floralis. I have this Beijing Opera makeup palette that they sent me, which is incredibly pretty. I mean, I think a lot of folks talk about these palettes just because of like the art behind them. They also recently sent me this one, which is the Floral Engraving Beauty Goddess makeup palette. It's like a really sturdy cardboard package. Like I wouldn't even necessarily read these as cardboard, but I think they are. And then they're magnetized. So here are the two Floralis palettes that I have. Do you guys want to see a review on these? Please let me know if you do. Zoom you guys back in a little bit. Let me know if you guys do want to see a review on either of these palettes. I can't really give you guys like a speed review of these just because I haven't really tried them, to be honest. If you guys don't really care or I don't see enough comments, I'll just declutter these. But if you guys do care, then I care. Shall we talk about, not that one. Let's talk about Rowan. These two palettes that are still from like, I think within the first year of them launching, the 1111 palette, which I still consider to be kind of a perfect palette, as well as the 52 degree palette. Like this is my favorite. This is definitely like within my favorite eyeshadow quads of all time. Like this might actually be the favorite eyeshadow quad of all time. So like, I do actually think that this is incredible. When I think about inspired, well thought out color stories, textures, innovation, this kind of palette comes to mind. Some of the most unique cream shadow textures that you will find on the market. This shade down here, oh my gosh. I think it's the shade Rosy, just with these beautiful, beautiful toppers. Everything about it just is good. I am finding now that I've had this for a long time, like I think they are getting a little bit drier than I don't know, than they once were. 1111 palette is staying. The 52 degree palette is also staying. Love this one as well. If you lean towards cool tones, the 52 degree palette is definitely where it's at. But this palette, the Gold Lust palette, do you see how immediately the textures are different? They are stiffer. They're way more satin focused. They kind of took the magic away from the palettes. I'm gonna go ahead and declutter this one just because I never reach for it, guys. It is a freaking shame. And you know what? Those palettes, specifically the Gold Lust palette, reminds me, like the formulas are not far off from like these Revlon palettes, the Illuminance palettes, which by the way, I'm going to go ahead and declutter this one. This is the Precious Metals palette, which I have actually compared that to the 52 degree palette from Rowan because there's a similar thing kind of going on here, kind of insanely so, I think you can see. But at the end of the day, the formula is just so much more sophisticated within the Rowan palette. I'm gonna go ahead and declutter this one because I just don't reach for it. And I'm gonna keep this as a reference item, the Revlon Illuminance, and what is it? Not Just Nudes, which ironically, this is literally just nudes. But anyway, I'm gonna keep this one, even though honestly, the formula, it is good for what it is, but I think you guys know I'm just like so into the absolute best of the best formulas, and this just isn't that. However, 52-degree palette again is staying. Shall we talk about some more KBeauty shadow palettes? I have a few more here. Do I have any more? I do. So here are some of the other KBeauty shadow palettes that I do have. I've really been trying to find my perfect palette. Let me open these two. I haven't even opened these. These are from Clio. I have the Soft Depth palette from Clio. I also have the Latte Senior palette, which definitely feels KBeauty to me. You can see like a lot of brands come out with these like mostly matte kind of eyeshadows with shades that are like so close that it's kind of like, why? I think this is a very different approach than a lot of like Western brands take. But I have not tried this one from Clio, so I'm going to keep it for now. And I also have not yet tried the Soft Depth palette, so I need to give these two a go. However, I have tried these other shadow palettes. So this is the Roman Secret, or I'm sorry, Dusty Fog Garden, not Secret Garden. Similar thing. These three shades right here are like pretty much all the same. I'll swatch them. Do you see, like, can you guys even really tell a difference? And because they're also incredibly lightly pigmented and a bit powdery, so I'm honestly just not impressed by the formula. And believe me, this isn't for lack of an appreciation necessarily for KBeauty eye looks. I love KBeauty eye looks, but I can get to those looks with formulas that that I prefer working with. So I'm not a huge fan of this one. I think I am going to declutter it. I have had good first impressions though with the Lily Bread Mood palette, and I do want to keep trying it. It feels like these have a little bit more of the pigment that I'm looking for. So I am going to go ahead and keep this one for now. Also, it's so adorable. The little like keyboard style, I find it very cute. But this Heemish glitter eyeshadow palette, the glitters are just not my typical, they're just not my fancy. They're more piecey and like true glitter pieces oftentimes. Or again, we have these kind of like sequin shades that unfortunately don't like necessarily translate, or they're just a bit too sheer for my personal preference. So I am going to go ahead and declutter this palette. This was, I think I bought this when I was trying to discover more wet looking eyeshadows in the KBeauty realm, and I have found a few, so you guys should go check out some of my wet looking eyeshadow videos. I'll leave a couple down below, but unfortunately this didn't fit the bill for me. Another palette I'm going to declutter is from Ether, and I'm not reaching for this palette. Beautiful color story, but I think finally I need to pass this along. My Moondust palette. Speaking of wet looking eyeshadows, this is a great palette to incorporate into a makeup collection that already has a lot of beautiful matte formulas and you want to play around with wet looking eyeshadows. This is a great kind of addition to a collection. We've got Cosmic Space Dust, which is really nice for more cool toned looks. Wild Dipper Rises Again. So freaking pretty, especially if you like more pink shades. The iconic Space Cowboy, which by the way, is not necessarily the same Space Cowboy that you're going to get in the single. Like for me, this feels a bit stiffer than that one. On the eyes, you can't really tell much of a difference. And then we have Star Cowgirl, which is pretty, but I don't love it as much as Space Cowboy, so I find myself not really reaching for it. But these are all more translucent, wet, glossy eyeshadows that can transform any look. Unfortunately, I think I feel like Urban Decay discontinued this palette. However, I did notice that Urban Decay is coming back out with their iconic Diamond Dog shade that they used to have in the Moondust line. That used to be one of my favorites, and I think they're re-releasing it, which is really exciting. So you guys should probably expect some sort of video on that if you want to see it. But anyway, if I can still find this, I'll leave it down below. Shall we talk about my Dior palettes? Now, I have heard that Dior has like repackaged these, and whether or not it's the same formula, I'm not sure. I might have to do some research on that. I gotta tell you, these are like some of my favorite eyeshadow palettes, so I really hope that's not the case here. I am gonna go ahead and declutter the Mitza palette, which is just not what I really reach for. Nevertheless, beautiful palette. But I know other people that would really get a ton of use out of it. So I'm gonna go ahead and declutter that. I also have a couple of palettes here. I have the Soft Cashmere palette, which is one of my favorite palettes that I own. It's just kind of the perfect neutral palette, in my opinion. They're soft, they're wearable. I feel like this is what I wanted the new Dip palette from Tom Ford to be. The shadows reflect better. There's matte shades that can actually give you some structure, or again, you can just use these as like pretty washes of color. So this feels like a more true everyday palette than the new Dip does. Love this one. So keeping that one, and also keeping the fan favorite on my channel, which is the New Look palette. I've done like some of your favorite looks that you guys have given me feedback on are with this palette, because the shades are just like beautiful, wet, grungy goodness. I mean, look at that. This matte shade, we're talking about like quality here, guys. Not all luxury eyeshadows are good. I feel like that has to be said. But these are good. And this shade right here, a perfect one and done. I mean, you can just use that on its own and you're going to get a pretty look. But this sparkly top coat up here, you can add that right on top of any eyeshadow and just adds that immediate touch of wet glossiness. And it's not too incredibly intense that I feel like you could tone it down a little bit if you wanted for just like a subtle gleam. I think I need to go swatch the new ones in person to see if the formula has changed or not. I do prefer this formula even to the Backstage format, or formula, I mean. But yeah, definitely keeping this one. We're in the home stretch here now. I have a couple of palettes from Revlon that I have not touched in a really long time. And there's nothing wrong with them, but I do think that it is time to declutter them. In particular, if you can still get the Slight Flex palette from Revlon, I think it's one of the best at an affordable price. This is a really beautiful, wet, creamy looking shadow right there. I mean, that looks pretty luxe to me. This shade over here, this beige, is so pretty. I have loved these palettes in the past, but they are kind of drying out now. I've had them for quite a while. They are powder, but they do kind of have this baked formula that sometimes does eventually dry out. I still really love this. Maybe I will pick it back up, especially for like an upcoming affordable makeup starter kit, which I am hopefully planning on doing another one pretty soon. I can see this being in that video. This palette, That's a Dub, like look at this shade. So pretty, right? Like Revlon really did a good job with these affordable palettes. But I do think it's time that they go, just again, because the formulas aren't the same. Speaking of an affordable palette that I think I'm gonna keep this for now. You can't get it anymore though, so I'm not gonna really stick here for too long. It's the Cookies and Dreams palette from e.l.f. One of my favorite affordable palettes because I love this blue. This brown shade is really pretty and blendable as well. I don't really use these two that much, but for now I am going to keep this. Now, a couple of Charlotte Tilbury palettes. Oh, actually, right before, I'm going to declutter this palette, the bite-sized Carnival Candy from e.l.f., just because I'm not really reaching for it. But these two palettes from Charlotte Tilbury, this is the Exaggerized palette, and I've been on the fence about this one because this is like such a beautiful wet sparkly top coat. But again, it's kind of like a similar thing that happened with the Tom Ford palettes, is like these are so like meh that it doesn't really make sense to me to keep this just for this one shade. Like it's so pretty, but again, like I'm looking for at least 3 out of the 4 gotta be winners. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and declutter this. And there's gotta be someone in my life that will get more use out of that. But I am going to keep the Instant Eye Smoky Eyes Are Forever. I actually did a bunch of my friends' makeup with this palette. It's just, the looks are just always so pretty. And you know what? As far as like green shades go, in combination with like these other shades, this feels a little bit more current to me than the other palettes that we were talking about, because the textures are a little bit thinner, so they become more one with the skin. I find that they look more current rather than these really creamy looking metallics, in a sense that they're like a bit thicker, not necessarily like juicier looking on the eyes, but like thick in a way that might look more powdery. For me, that feels a little bit outdated, but this still feels current to me, so I am going to keep it. You know what? Let's talk about Sigma, because I do have a couple of Sigma palettes here. This new Mood palette, I said that I was gonna keep it and like try it out, and it just has not happened. It just hasn't happened. But look at how beautiful it is, and like it still has this, even like this little protective thing on it. Like this could be like a really pretty gift to someone in my life. So I am going to just put this right back in the package, and someone else can get some use out of that. The Enchanted palette is so pretty, like very whimsical. Like this shade right here, this whole palette and the color story reminds me a lot of the Huda Beauty palette. I forget what that one's called. But like this shade is very reminiscent of a lot of those. I'm just not really reaching for this that much. I think this would be pretty for like a kind of like a fairy kind of vibe. Maybe I'll see if a friend wants this, just because I'm not using it much. I will say I am keeping the Ritzy palette, because the Ritzy palette I see myself actually getting the most use out of. One, this shade Haze. I love shades like this, and it's incredibly pretty and smooth. This shade Gold Rush is great, like so pretty and grungy, and again it has a little bit more of a translucent base, so I find that it's really pretty for layering. This to me just feels like something I'll get more use out of, you know, just in general more neutral. So I'll be keeping this one. I am going to be keeping the Vega palette from Lisa Eldridge. Definitely a small but mighty palette, I'll say. These matte textures, they're again something between like a satin and a matte. Do you see how they just have that reflection that I've been talking about, how some eyeshadows have that quality? The Lisa Eldridge does, the ones from Revlon do. So freaking pretty. And these two shades, these sparkles, they're so good. If you love a cool toned palette, this is a really beautiful one. If you love something like the New Look palette from Dior, the Soft Cashmere palette from Dior, this is very similar. We're in the same territory with this palette. I just got to get more use out of it. I need to pull it back out. Just such classic, beautiful packaging. I do have a couple of Beauty Pie palettes from James Malloy, who is a makeup artist I really enjoy, but I have not gotten much use out of these. If I can still get these, then I will get my hands into these, but if you can't, then I'll probably just declutter them so that someone else can. So for now, these are going to be in the declutter bin until I check. All right, let's organize a little bit the products that I am decluttering. Okay, so here are all of the eyeshadow palettes I'm decluttering. I feel really good about this. This definitely needed to happen. And now let's organize some of the palettes that I am keeping. All right, everyone, and this is my new eyeshadow palette collection. I definitely pared down and I'm feeling a lot better about it. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. It definitely helps me know that you guys like my style of declutter videos. I know they tend to be longer. I know the speed reviews take a little bit longer, but that's what I really like to do. Hopefully you guys like that as well. I'll leave everything I talked about today down below, and definitely make sure if there's any of these products you want me to test, please leave me a comment and let me know. Thank you guys so much for being here, and I will see you in my next one.